Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm so excited to share this message with you because God gave me such a profound revelation while I was studying Bible study this morning in Deuteronomy. And I was in chapter 2 of Deuteronomy and I only read one verse and all of a sudden God just struck me with this revelation and it was so good. And I wrote down 3 pages of notes. So if I'm looking down a lot, it's because I'm reading some of the things that I journaled about. I'm gonna try to remember so I'm not always looking down. But it was so good. God was just speaking to me. And I love when that happens because I haven't had that happen in a while. And God used to do that to me all the time. And I just felt like I was much more clear this morning. And so when I was studying, I just read one verse and all of a sudden God started downloading all these things to me. And I'm gonna share with you because I know that this is gonna resonate and relate to a lot of you guys. So let me read you the one verse and you're gonna be like, how did you get all of that from that one verse? But I'm gonna explain how, like always, how God gave me this message. So it was Deuteronomy chapter 2, the end of verse 7, and it says, "The Lord your God has been with you these past 40 years and you have lacked nothing." You're gonna think how did you get all of this from that one sentence? And it's because it brought me back to what I'm currently going through in my own life. It literally gave me a revelation of wow, it spoke to me. I know that, have you guys ever read the Bible and you read one thing and it jumps out, that verse jumps out at you? I've experienced that so many times since I've been a Bible reader the last year and a half. And I love when that happens because you just know that that is God speaking to you. You know that he's trying to tell you something. He's trying to reveal something to you. And when that happens to me, I sit there and I pray and I ask God what he's trying to reveal to me. And from that one verse is how God gave me 3 pages of notes. So I'm gonna share what he shared with me, and I know that this is gonna resonate with you because I actually had another video plan that I was gonna record today that had nothing to do with Bible study or this, and God said, release this word, release this message, because I know that this is gonna help so many of you. If you are struggling right now from grieving your past life, maybe you just recently got saved, or maybe you've been saved for a while and you are facing a lot of tests and tribulations and trials, and you're like, I miss it back then. I miss it back in my old days. I miss it when life was easy. I miss it when I had these friends. I miss it when I could go to the bars. I miss it when life was... There's so many things, and God really spoke to me because, I'm facing my own trials and tribulations and tests, and sometimes I have these thoughts of man, I kind of miss when I used to be able to do this, or I kind of miss when I had this job because I was able to rely on my bank account and rely on my money. And if you guys have been following me for some time, you know that God called me to full-time ministry, and it's not easy. It is not easy. And for those of you who do follow me and maybe you're in ministry, you understand and you know that relying on God for his daily bread and daily provision every single day is not easy. And so I read that verse, and God knows all of our thoughts. God knows what we're struggling with. God knows our circumstances. God knows what we lack faith in. And when I read that verse, boom, it just spoke right to me because it reminded me of all the times that, okay, so let me read it again. The Lord your God has been with you these past 40 years and you have lacked nothing. So this is when Moses was talking about, he was remembering back on all these times when God brought them to each place that they camped at, and he was talking about all the things that they did, all the places that they defeated, all the cities that they were able to overcome and overtake. And when I read that verse, it brought me back to when they were going through the wilderness, God never allowed them to not be met with a need. For 40 years, he provided things for the Israelites. And it reminded me of wow, Alicia, whenever I start doubting where I'm at in my current situation, whether it's a financial need that I need, or whether it's friends, or whatever it is, replace it with whatever it is in your life. But whatever it is, you start going and thinking back on the former days and being well, I remember when you start thinking of all these good memories that you had with your old friends, and you start thinking of your old lifestyle or the places that you used to go, and you have nostalgia and you reminisce on the good times, because when we are faced with circumstances and situations, we can become blinded of actually God's provision and miracles that he's provided for us, and we start thinking back like, I wish it was easier. And so this is going to be such a good message. So if you are missing your old life after being saved, this is not an uncommon thing. It's actually very common. And guess what? The Israelites even did that. The Israelites even did that. God saved them from misery and slavery when they were in Egypt. He delivered them out of Egypt and was bringing them into the promised land in Canaan, okay? And it took them 40 years to get from Egypt to the promised land because of their unbelief and disobedience. And the main one being their unbelief. They were disobedient because of their unbelief, which was the bigger sin because their unbelief actually led them to their disobedience. It led them to miss their old life. And they were, at first, when God delivered them out of Egypt, they were excited, they were grateful, they were happy. And when they were first delivered, they were like, oh my gosh, yes, this is the best day ever. They were so excited to go into the promised land. But immediately following their celebration and their gratefulness, when they started facing little trials, little tribulations, they started to feel differently about their circumstances because they were facing many obstacles, which were actually tests sent from God. But time and time again, God met their every need, including manna. He rained down bread from heaven. He provided food for them every single day. He provided water for them. He provided water out of a rock. God was showing them many miracles. He was doing all of these things and providing for them and doing miracles. And even when the Israelites saw that God was doing all of these things and providing for them, when things got tough, they forgot about God's provision and started missing things from the past, even though they were slaves. They forgot that they were slaves. They forgot that they were miserable, but all their carnal, fleshly desires like food and water and being comfortable and being easy and having this familiar routine, they forgot that they were actually slaves, because where they currently were in their circumstances of being uncomfortable and having to trust and depend on God fully, they wanted to go back to when life was easy. And I know that we do that too in our own lives. When before we were saved, before we started living in freedom and following God's plan for our lives, we got to do all of these things. We thought that we didn't have consequences. We could go out and go to the clubs. We could go out and get drunk when things got tough. We could depend and rely on these friends to be there for us. And we never trusted in God. But then when we got saved, it's like God told us to forget certain things. God told us to get rid of those friends. God told us to get a new job. God called us out of this job, and God told us to move to this city. And when things get tough, we start thinking back on the former things of our past, and we're like, wow, I miss when things were easy, or I miss when I had so much fun doing this, even though those things were sinful, even though when you remember and think back on those times, you were actually miserable. This can even relate to a toxic relationship, or even a relationship in general. It doesn't even have to be toxic. But when God tells you to get rid of that friendship or get rid of that relationship, and when things start getting hard in your new relationship, you start thinking back of like, oh, well, this ex wasn't that bad, or I had it better back there, or I had it better with this friend because this friend does this. And you can apply this to any part of your life. But this is exactly what the Israelites were doing. And God led me to Exodus chapter 16, because I remember when I was reading Exodus, they started complaining about all the things that they didn't have, and they started missing what they did have in Egypt. And it says in chapter 16, verse 2, starting in verse 2, the entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into the wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. Okay, so this is when they were complaining. They were complaining to Moses. They weren't even complaining to God. They were complaining to Moses because they knew that Moses had this relationship with God. They didn't even have their own relationship with God. So they were complaining to Moses about how they had it better in Egypt because they got to sit around and eat pots of meat and eat all the bread they wanted and all these things, not even remembering that they were slaves and in misery. And even months after their deliverance coming out of Egypt, they were still enslaved by not actually being physical slaves in Egypt, but they were slaves in their mindset. And so not only did God deliver them out of Egypt, but now God was trying to deliver Egypt out of them while they were in the wilderness. And that is why they did not get to the promised land as quickly as they wanted to. It took them 40 years because God was still teaching them. God was still developing them, and God was still wanting them to fully depend and rely on God. And they weren't. They had idols that they were relying on. They made all these different statues, and they were making Moses do certain things, and they were complaining and complaining and grumbling, even after they were seeing God's provision every single day. And then God led me to Numbers chapter 11, verse 5 says, "We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt along with the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There's nothing to look at but this manna." So manna was the bread from heaven, but they didn't know that it was bread, so they called it manna. They didn't know what it was. And they were just complaining about a lack of meat, and they just started remembering all the kinds of foods that they had in Egypt, and they were just complaining. They weren't remembering that they were miserable. They weren't remembering that they were slaves. Their current situation made them blinded to the miracles of what God has and was doing for them. They were uncomfortable, and they just wanted to go back to being comfortable. This relates to our own lives so much because after we're born again, I know that I can speak for myself. After I was born again, you know, like the first 6 months or even a year, it was so exciting. It was so overwhelming. God was speaking so much, and God was providing all these things, and God was doing all these miracles, because that is God trying to draw you closer to him. That is God trying to show you, look, and God does that. When we first become saved, how excited are we? How much do we celebrate? How much do we preach the gospel? How much do we tell people about Jesus? But then when we start facing real trials and tribulations, and when God stretches our faith, and when God sends all these tests our way, it gets hard, and then there's these obstacles, and we have to overcome. And then after a certain period of time, when the celebration has died down and when all the excitement has died down, we start thinking about our old life. We start thinking about our old ways. We start wanting to go back when things were easy. We start thinking and reminiscing on memories. And I know I've done that for myself. I know that in the beginning when I got saved, I was so excited, and I was like, and I still am like that, but I do think back sometimes on my past of wow, I really miss those friendships, but then I think about the actual friendships, and I'm like, well, I remember being in those certain friendships and wanting out. And so that's exactly what the Israelites were doing, is that they were so blinded because of their current circumstances that their mind was playing tricks on them. And that's exactly a tactic of the enemy. Is Satan tries to make us remember what we should forget, like our sin and our past toxic lifestyle and all the old habits and addictions, and make us forget what we should actually remember, which is the past victories and miracles of God's provision. And so when you think back on your past life and you're like, I had it better here, or I had this and I had that, think about you actually being in that place when you were in your past, and always praying and asking God to get you out of those things. It's only because you're uncomfortable right now, but this is exactly where God has you for a reason. Because just like the Israelites, when they were in all these places and they had all these tests and tribulations and faced with obstacles all the time, God was using that to develop them. God was using that to test them. He was testing their conviction. He was testing their faith. He was growing them. But they still had so much unbelief in their heart. And that is the only reason why they did not get to the promised land. That is the only reason why they spent 40 years, and not 2 years, not 1 year, 40 years stuck in the wilderness, because they weren't trusting and relying on God. They were still trusting and relying on all these other things. They were trying to take matters into their own hands. And we do this with our own lives. We do this with our own lives so many times. And so the Israelites, they quickly forgot the weight of the burden that they had in Egypt when it started to get hard in the wilderness. And we do that the same thing when it starts to get hard, when we start facing trials and tribulations, and our minds drift back to the good old days from the past. Ecclesiastes 7:10 says, "Don't say, why were the former days better than these, since it is not wise of you to ask this." Wow, did God slap me in the face with that one? Because we do that so many times, and we think it's harmless, and we think that you know, we can just sit there and reminisce and think about all the times from the past, but God says, he says in Ecclesiastes that that's not wise. He doesn't want us to think back on the former days because the latter days are going to be so much better. We're just in this testing period. We're just in the wilderness, and this is part of our spiritual growth. This is exactly where God wants us, and that's exactly where God was wanting the Israelites to be, in that place, to not remember. He was trying to train them and teach them, but they were not wanting to get out of their own mindset. They just kept complaining and kept playing over the same thing over again. And that's why it took that many generations. God was waiting for all these generations to die so that the unbelief could turn into belief, so that they could take the promised land. It was just generation after generation of unbelief after unbelief. And God does not want that for us. God wants us to put our past and bury it and step into the forward, because we can't walk through the new doors that God has for us as long as we're looking backwards, remembering on the past. Israel probably missed Egypt from a few things, okay? They probably missed their physical comfort and convenience, because Egypt was one of the most advanced civilizations on earth, and those who lived there had material benefits and material gain, and even some of the slaves did, which is why they ate so good. And to some degree they had other benefits that they had in Egypt while they were slaves. When we start to follow God's plan for our lives, it often involves a huge change in our standard of living, like changing jobs, getting new friends, changing hobbies, desires, and getting rid of certain things that God tells us to. And so we start to tend to long for our former life when we are faced with trials. But God allows these trials to test our conviction and our faith. Another thing that Israel probably missed is their familiar routine. Us as humans, we have this automatic, like, innate fear of the unknown. When we are born again, we lose our familiar routine, like our jobs. Like, I know for me, when I got saved and God started putting a calling on my life, and he's like, quit your job and you're gonna do full-time ministry, quit your job and you're gonna be an author, quit your job and do all these things. And at first I'm like, okay, like, if God's telling me to do that, I want to do that. And then after like months down the road, when I started running out of my savings and started running out of money, it was hard. And so many times was I thinking about, like, did I make the right decision? Should I go back to, should I get my old job back? Should I do all these things to try to make money? And every single time I try to get a job, what did God do? He slammed the door in my face. I didn't get the job. I didn't get this. I didn't get that. I tried to apply to like 4 to 5 different jobs because I wasn't relying. And God had to just break down all my idols. He had to break down everything that I used to rely on and allow me to fully trust that God would provide. And that's exactly what God was doing with the Israelites, is he was breaking down not only their routine, but he was breaking down all their idols. He was getting rid of all the things that they were used to. And so God does the same thing in our life. He breaks us, he gets rid of the old. He gets rid of the old so he can replace the old with the new. Our jobs, even our status in our community, like the old things that we used to depend on to feel worthy. You know, I know I'm speaking to someone right now, to feel worthy, relationships, people, even family members, best friends. God gets rid of all, your entire circle. He gets rid of everything that you were used to because he wants us to die to our old and he wants to build the new. But we can't build the new on an old foundation. We have to fully get rid of the old and fully focus on the new, so that way we can build a new foundation, and that new foundation is built on Christ. And we can't build a new foundation built on Christ as long as we're holding on to the old things that God is trying to get us out of. And that's exactly what God was doing with the Israelites. He was trying to get them out of their familiar routine. And even though the Israelites' routine back in Egypt was awful, they generally knew what to expect, because they were just in this familiar routine. Even though that routine was awful, even though they were slaves, even though they were just getting treated awfully and they were bound and they couldn't leave and they were just stuck in Egypt, they still were addicted to their familiar routine. And so that's why in the wilderness, they were like, what is this? Like, they had to do all these things. They had to collect their own food. They had to collect the manna every single morning. They had to do all of these things, and they had to fully put their trust and dependence on God. But when they started facing uncertainties of following Moses in the wilderness, they actually began to long for what they were used to, even though it was slavery. And so now the Israelites had to fully rely and depend on God. They had to get rid of their idols, because God does the same for us, to see where our dependence and trust lie. Our possessions, our status, our money, even other people, instead of relying solely on God. He will break down all the idols in our life that are a hindrance to our spiritual growth. And Israel had a hard time trusting God, which is why it took them 40 years to finally realize this. Like I said before, how Satan loves to twist things. When things get hard, Satan loves to put these things in our mind to be like, oh, your current situation sucks, or oh, you had it better back then. Why don't you just go back to this? Why don't you go text your old friend? Don't you miss them? Like, why don't you check up on them? Why don't you go back to when things were easy? Why don't you go get a money because you're not making a lot of money at this age in your life? Oh, you're not married? Oh, why don't you go back to that toxic relationship? Oh, why don't you go back and text that guy? You really miss him. You're lonely. All these things. And you know, sometimes I have to battle with that, and you have to take your thoughts captive and remember why God delivered you out of that. You have to get rid of your own Egypt, whatever your own Egypt is in your life. Bad behaviors, habits, bad thought patterns, people, job, like things that were from your past that God delivered you out of. You cannot go back there. You cannot go back there, because otherwise you're going to be stuck in this pattern of a lesson that God is trying to teach you, just like God was trying to teach the Israelites over and over again. But they spent 40 years in the same place, going around and around and around, because they weren't picking up on the lesson. They weren't trusting God. They were truly trying to depend on other things and not believing that the promised land was the land that God was telling them to possess, because they were scared. They were scared of these giants in the land. They were scared that they were more numerous than them. They were scared that they didn't have all these things that God said, if you go there, I'm gonna make you overcome it. If you go there, I'm gonna fight this battle for you. If you go there, I'm gonna defeat all these nations and you're gonna take over the land. But they didn't believe that they could do that, because they were like, well, we're small and we're like grasshoppers compared to them, and they're so big. They weren't trusting God. They weren't trusting God. And so I don't know what kind of Egypt God is trying to deliver you out of. Maybe he's already delivered you out of Egypt, or maybe he's trying to still deliver the Egypt out of you. But whatever that is, just forget the former things and start focusing on where you are right now, because the enemy will use the place that you are struggling and try to make you miss your former days. And so I just hope that this video spoke to some of you and gave you a better understanding of why God gives us stories of the Bible, and gives there are so many revelations that you can get just from reading about God delivering the Israelites out of Egypt. Because when I read that one verse, it immediately sparked something inside of me, because when things get hard in my own life, I start thinking about like, wow, like before ministry, when I had this job or had this job, like I could go do this, I could go do this, I could travel, I could blah, 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 XYZ, like I could do all these things. But I have to remember that I hated my life back then. I have to remember that I was miserable back then. I have to remember that I had so much depression and anxiety because I didn't have a purpose. And then now that God called me to ministry, I have a purpose. I love helping people. I love teaching people about the Bible. I love what I do. But sometimes it gets hard. And sometimes I think back on like, wow, life was easier back then. And when that verse just like popped out of the Bible and literally just like spoke to me, it's so good, because it says the Lord your God has been with you these past 40 years and you have lacked nothing. Just like God provided for the Israelites for 40 years every single day, so will God provide for you. So I don't know what you're going through right now, because I know that this spoke to me and ministered to me, but I don't know what you're going through, but God will provide. God did not lead you God did not deliver you from where you were and lead you to wherever you are now just to leave you there. He's guiding you there, and he's leading you to where you're supposed to go. But this period of the waiting, this period of being in the wilderness, this period of getting rid of all your old things from your past, God is training you. God is testing you. God is doing all of these things for a reason, so that way when you get to the promised land where God has you, where God wants to take you, you are ready, you are prepared. And so I hope that this spoke to some of you guys, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.